Hey, if I could quickly ask you at least one more question here on this show. I know it's not the drive-thru, but
all right.
Did you see something recently online about Charlotte Flair signing with a sports agency?
Yes, I did. As a matter of fact, coincidentally enough, somewhere in here, in all of my paperwork, I have an email from one of the listeners. And here it is from Jack. Jack. Hey, Jim, I just saw a random tidbit in the news that Charlotte Flair has signed with some sports agency. This was on the internet on some of the news sites. Apparently, this agency has represented pro football players for the past 4 or 5 years, but now they're branching out to represent athletes across multiple sports, and Charlotte is the first wrestler they've signed. This gives me cause to pause, as we will talk about in a second, but here is Jack's question. Since we know Vince would sooner be dead than allow wrestlers to unionize, what would you suppose his opinion would be on talents having agents that he might have to deal with? What do you personally make of this? I feel like as a promoter, you would despise wrestlers having agents, but I also think as a talent and as a person in general, well, thank you for calling me a person in general. Sometimes I'm a specific person. You would support this if it meant the wrestlers would benefit and Vince would have to squirm a bit more come contract negotiation time. Another question, if you feel so inclined, is there any way you could see that Vince might try to kibosh the idea of wrestlers having agents? Could he potentially refuse to deal with wrestlers that have representation and put the freeze on it that way, considering WWE's grip on the industry? I could imagine he'd have to tread carefully so as not to get in legal trouble handling this situation. Jack, I hate to break some news to you. You were right about Vince's reaction, but you're 20 years behind the times. Does everybody not know that there's been some guys since the 90s, since the Attitude Era, that have had agents? Is this not a widely known thing, Brian?
I thought it was. I mean, Barry Bloom is pretty well known, and he got introduced to wrestling, I guess, through Jesse Ventura in the mid-'80s. So, I mean, it's been at least since the mid-'80s that Jesse Ventura brought an agent into the WWF.
That dadgum Ventura. And see, actually, Barry Bloom was the one that I was going to bring up because obviously Jesse started it in that the lawsuit that he had where he ended up getting royalties. That's why that it was written in the contracts of future announcers that you would not get royalties from your announcing work, because Jesse, when he couldn't wrestle anymore because of the Agent Orange, as he told me one time personally, and that he suffered in Vietnam, he had the blood clots. I don't know whether that's true or not now with what all Jesse has said since then. But even in the early contracts with the wrestlers, it was written they were going to get royalties. That's how all those guys made all that money on the action figures and stuff in the 80s. But announcers had never been covered because all announcers had just been regular announcers. They didn't get royalties. And then Jesse becomes a talent, color commentator, etc., starts that trend. That was his lawsuit. Because it wasn't specifically covered, he ended up winning a significant sum in royalties. I can't remember how much, Brian, but it wasn't like tens of millions of dollars, but it was more than Vince wanted to pay. And so then, since then, announcers don't get royalties on that. But further to the point of the agents, yeah, that was Jesse. And he was in Hollywood at that point, too, and making movies with Schwarzenegger. And a few of the guys that got movie work in the late 80s and early 90s got agents. I don't remember them branching out to actually represent anyone in wrestling until the mid-'90s, the start of the Attitude Era. Do you remember any widespread use before that?
Widespread use? No. I mean, various guys had agents in different ways. I mean, technically, Cola Quariani was Antonino Rocca's agent, but it was very different. Yeah, but and see, when you go back, Jack Pfeffer was an agent for a number of wrestlers. Yeah.
But as far as actual legitimate sports agents representing wrestlers, rather than it goes back to the dawn of time and in boxing too, with fucking we find a Argentinian heavyweight and we'll push him and I'll be the manager and blah, blah, blah. Or if a guy broke you into wrestling, he would be your agent or shoot manager or whatever in those days. But finally, Barry Bloom, in the 90s, when the guys started making a fucking fortune, when Bischoff was spending Turner's money and those guys were getting those ridiculous contracts, Nash and Hall, and then it spread out to the Austins and the Rocks of the world. Barry Bloom was constantly talking I don't know. I'm sure he and Vince have had conversations, but at the time, the burden of dealing with Barry Bloom fell on Jim Ross because he was the vice president of talent relations. He did all the contract deals, obviously with input or direction or whatever from Vince on whatever he wanted to have input on. And so JR had to be the one. So the worm turned. JR must have felt like he was a pretty good agent because then when JR needed an agent, he hired Barry Bloom. I mean, I can understand. As far as wrestling, yeah, in the territories, nobody would have had a fucking agent because they weren't going to give up 10% of their fucking money or whatever the percentage is to book themselves. And that's what I hate about modern wrestling. Everything else got fucking big business, and so did this agent horse shit. If I can't fucking talk in the wrestling business to the guy that's going to be hiring me or booking me and make my own deal, it's not a place I want to go. But having said that, if I'm getting into television and movies and people are trying to hire me for acting or all these other things, and that's something I want an agent because I don't know anything about that. And you should have someone representing you or whatever. Maybe instead of getting agents, sometimes some of the guys need a financial advisor more than an agent. But
it's funny too that Jim Ross ended up hiring Barry Bloom to be his agent.
Yeah, of course, because better to have him on inside the castle pissing out than outside pissing in, right? But anyway, yes, I think I've always thought it was ridiculous, the idea of a wrestler having agents when talking to a wrestling promoter and a wrestling booker about how they're going to be fucking used or whatever the fuck. If you can't do that business on your own, you don't need to be in the business. But now that the WWE has got to be such a big business and it's so fucking goofy and they've got contracts that are written with every clause and loophole and whatever the fuck, you probably ought to have an agent, an attorney, a goddamn staff of 15 to figure it out because you're going to get fucked some kind of way, which is another reason why I hate the modern wrestling business. You can't even do your own deals anymore. Well, you can with every other company in the world because they don't matter. So anyway, but yeah, and you are right. Vince never wanted to deal with any agents. Nobody wants to deal with a fucking agent if you're hiring somebody, which is kind of the idea of the wrestler hiring them. But I just hate that wrestling has become such a big fucking clusterfuck. It's like Hollywood now too, that you have to have people representing you to get booked into fucking Louisiana or whatever.
There are guys that are agents for indie wrestlers. Did you ever run into that with like Ring of Honor? Like Bill Behrens, isn't he like an agent for a bunch of different guys on the indies, or at least he was?
Well, yes, but Bill was fun and pleasant to deal with because he understood the wrestling business, and it wasn't like we were doing fucking. I've signed Jay Lethal with Bill Behrens, and it was a very easy and pleasant experience, and everybody was honest with everybody because Bill was doing that to help, especially a lot of the guys on independence, especially in his part of the country, but that. It's hard. Bill is a huge detail person. I don't know how Bill Behrens has the energy and has had for the 30 years that I've known him to keep up with all this shit. He must never sleep, but he's on top of everything. And as Vince used to say, if you ask him what time it is, he'll tell you how to build the watch. But he would, instead of all these individual guys having to deal with these numerous independent promoters and keep track of all these dates and everything, he was helping these guys get more bookings and keep them straight. It wasn't like he was negotiating any goddamn 6-picture contracts at, fucking MGM. So, when there's not that, he knew the wrestling business and was happy to talk to the promoters and help the guys because he could help them understand, hey, you can get a better deal like this, or don't let this guy treat you like that. But there was not, hundreds of millions of dollars on the line. But Bill's, hey, a wrestling agent, because that's what I was going to say. If your wrestling agent that's dealing with wrestling people for you has 30 years of experience in and around the wrestling business, that's fine. But when your wrestling agent starts trying to negotiate a motion picture deal, or what I'm saying here, wish all the best for Charlotte, but does she have to be the canary in the coal mine? The first wrestler they've represented, they've never talked to any people in the wrestling business, and they're going to start by negotiating with the WWE? I'm just, that perks my ears up a little bit, but I hope everything works out for the best. But I'm sure that they could probably negotiate a wonderful contract for her if she was going to play for the fucking Chicago Bears, because they've represented a bunch of football players. But I'm just trying to figure out why they're getting into wrestling, and she's their maiden voyage.
The guy they hired to be the president of WWE, he was an agent, right? Nick Khan?
I believe so. For
CAA, yeah.
Was he even a sports agent, or was he a movie star agent type agent? Isn't CAA actors in Hollywood?
I think he was television.
Television? You know what? Well, I guess all I've got to say is I need to call up and make an appointment with my doctor to get my oil changed, and then go over to Valvoline and get a good colonoscopy. Stick to your fucking specialties, people.
All right.
Oh, there you have it.
There you have it.
All right. Anyway, I'll tell you one thing. Regardless of what the sport is, Brian Last, regardless of what the professional or sport is, regardless of who's representing who, there's one way that the Cult of Cornette listeners out there can make big money. Can you guess? My bookie. If you're betting on the NFL, if you're betting on college ball, if you're betting on, are they playing the World Series this year?
Yeah, right now, actually. We're in the midst of it.
I heard something about that on TV. I don't really keep up with that because I don't watch baseball. But whatever they're playing, or if you want to bet on any kind of odds of whether these agents will represent Charlotte Flair well, go to MyBookie. Thousands of lines available on all your favorite sports and events. You can turn game day into payday with MyBookie. Back the big favorites. Just consider the option of putting a couple in a parlay. I've had a couple in a parlay every once in a while. There was this couple from Cleveland.
Behind the dumpster.
No, that was Greenville. But anyway, I believe it was Arnold Finster anyway, nevertheless, consider putting a couple in a parlay for a bigger payout. Parlays make meaningless games exciting, but more importantly, they give you a chance to turn ordinary bets into real money makers. Don't forget the underdogs. The thing about the NFL, underdogs are never really dogs on Sunday. Sometimes they're cats, but every team truly has a chance to win, and you do too. Game spreads, championship futures, player prop bets. It's never too late to get in on the action. Turn your sports knowledge into actual cash in your wallet. And when you sign up at MyBookie, use our promo code JCE to claim a deposit match, dollar for dollar, all the way up to $1,000. You put in 100, they give you another 100. That's the way these things work. Promo code JCE. Claim your deposit when you claim your bonus when you make your deposit. Whether it be the stacked UFC cards, the presidential prop bets, we all know who we're betting on, and all the major sports and more. Sign up today. Begin your winning season exclusively at MyBookie.